Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lecture 20 in our course on general psychology. And this is the beginning of a new unit, and that unit is about psychological development. We've talked a lot about things like the senses, memory, learning. We talk about it sometimes in animals, but we're usually talking about humans, and most typically we're talking about adult humans. So in this unit, we'll talk about how we get from birth to adulthood, how psychological abilities develop, when they develop. So we're talking about development. And a big part of development is the basic abilities that we develop. Uh, Obviously, when we're first born, we don't have very many abilities, either physical or mental, but we develop both. We come up with both as we age. And so things like crawling, grabbing things, walking around, these are physical abilities, and we certainly develop those as we grow. But there are also mental abilities that we often take for granted. So certainly our memories get better, our ability to learn gets better, but also we learn about the physical world. We start making assumptions, making predictions about the way the world works. And so, for example, we'll talk about how when an object is no longer visible, but you saw it before, it doesn't cease to exist. And we know that. But when you are a baby, you don't know that. Uh, Also, things like liquids, things that are pliable, uh, retain their same mass and overall volume, even if they look a little bit different. You have to learn that too. We'll also talk about social development. So how we start to develop relationships when we're small children, how we infer people's intentions, how we understand people's emotions. So these are all things that allow us to function socially. And again, we often don't think about them, but we are not born with them. And so those are abilities that we have to develop as we grow. There's also moral development. And here I'm not talking about a particular moral stance that certain moral ideals are better than others. Here I'm talking about the fact that children don't start with moral ideals. They'll often start with things like rules that are based on consequences if they break them. And from there, things become more abstract. You can start to learn general principles, and you can start to learn that certain things are moral or immoral based not on instruction, but based on more abstract principles, and you can reason about those principles. So in particular, what we're going to do is learn about those different abilities that children acquire. I've already mentioned a couple of them, but there are other physical abilities, other mental abilities that children have to acquire as well. We'll also see that, again, we don't start off with a real rich social model of other people. That we have to learn that other people have their own desires, have their own emotional responses, have their own states of knowledge. So those are all components of other people's minds that we have to learn to think about. But we'll also see that early childhood experience can have lasting effects. And here we're talking a lot about social development. So one's early social relationship with one's caregiver, which we call attachment, can have long-lasting effects on future relationships, on how we deal with the world. And so those early childhood experiences do have an impact on our later life. And we'll also understand that those moral models, what we think of as right and wrong, that changes over time. Not just what we consider right and wrong, but how we even think about those concepts. In the beginning, we think of those concepts as being defined by what they will do for us as the decision maker. Later on, we think less about consequences and more about things like social rules or abstract principles. So we'll cover all of that in this session. So, of course, we develop prenatally. Uh, Conception is the beginning of our development, but we do a lot of development in the womb. And so there are different stages of prenatal development. During one of them, during the earliest, you are a zygote. You are simply a fertilized egg. So you have all the chromosomes that you're going to have as an adult, but in terms of your body structure, you're very, very simple. You're just a small collection of cells. And that lasts for a couple of weeks. Then once the zygote implants in the wall of the uterus, then you become an embryo. And this lasts for a few weeks, from the second week after conception to approximately the 8th week. So that is the stage at which uh, the person is referred to as an embryo. And you may have heard that term, embryo. And it's distinct from the term fetus, which you've probably also heard. And a fetus is the term used for that 9th week up until actual birth. And so there are different stages of prenatal development. And during each of these, of course, the body is developing, and what will eventually become the brain is developing. So we're not really learning anything yet in the womb, although there is evidence that fetuses can learn sounds as they're transmitted through the womb. But obviously, we're not very sophisticated, and yet our bodies develop to a surprising degree. Now, of course, there are influences on development. We are uh, not destined to develop into a certain physical form. There are things that can affect that. Certainly, nutrition affects it. So, babies can be born underweight. They can be born prematurely based on trauma. But they can also have their development affected by what are called teratogens. And these are substances that the mother can take in or ingest in some way that affect development. Often these chemicals will cause birth defects of one sort or another. We already talked in our unit on psychoactive drugs about the effects of alcohol and fetal alcohol syndrome. We've already covered that. I'm not going to cover it again here. But in that sense, alcohol is a teratogen. It can affect fetal development. And of course, those effects will, if they are serious enough, continue to impair the individual throughout their entire lives. Uh, Tobacco and nicotine also seem to have an effect on development. Um, the evidence is a little more equivocal there, but in terms of early births and effect on birth weight. But there is some evidence for that as well. You can have an effect on development through cigarette smoking, for example. And embryos, so that stage between zygote and fetus, are particularly vulnerable to teratogens. So embryos are obviously not fully developed, neither are fetuses, but they're not very far along. And so a lot of their body plan still has yet to develop. Um, you still have a lot of cell differentiation going on. The organs aren't fully developed. And so because there's so much further to go in terms of development, uh, disrupting the development of an embryo can be very harmful. Surprisingly, most development occurs after birth. And so I don't mean that in a glib sense. Obviously, you spend 9 months in the womb and much more than that out of it. I don't mean that you spend most of your life after your birth. Of course, that's true. But when you're born, your brain is about a quarter the size of what it will eventually be. And that is unusual among animals. So many animals are born fairly well developed, both cognitively and physically. Um, they can perhaps walk around even hours after being born. And of course, for human babies, it can take around a year before the individual can walk. So a lot of catching up to do, so to speak, after birth. And there are a couple of reasons given for that. First is just physical constraints. So obviously, the size of the brain in part determines the size of the head. And the head can only be so big if it's going to pass through the birth canal. So our brains, and therefore our heads, are about as big as they can be without risking complications during birth. Uh, Another argument put forth is that uh, we inhabit a really wide array of environments as human beings. Lots of animals uh, sit there in their evolutionary niche, the habitat that they evolved in. But humans occupy a large portion of the world's surface, and environments differ quite widely. And so the argument in there is that we should develop after our birth. It's not just that we're physically constrained, but it benefits us to develop after birth because we need to adapt to the environment that we live in. And so there's a couple of reasons, but the fact is that so much of your development happens after birth. Relative to animals, we're born without a lot of our physical abilities. We have to learn those. We have to develop and grow and gain those abilities. Okay, so we just talked about the process that occurs before birth. What happens after birth? What happens during infancy? So we can talk about early perceptual processing. That is, what are infants and babies capable of seeing? What are they capable of witnessing and understanding? So when it comes to vision, and vision is perhaps the sense that we care most about as human beings. It's also the one we tend to know the most about as psychologists. Infants can see about 12 inches when they're first born, so not very far. They can't see what you're doing across the room, but they can see at about the distance that a person is from them if the infant's being fed or being cared for in some way. So they can't see very far, but they can see far enough for an infant. And we can one thing we can measure as psychologists is gaze. That is what infants look at and how long they look at it for. So one thing we know is that infants habituate both to visual stimuli and other stimuli as well. And habituation means the phenomenon by which a person gets used to a stimulus and stops responding to it or diminishes their response to it. So new stimuli tend to grab our attention for longer than stimuli we witnessed before, especially if we witnessed it a lot. So infants can habituate also, and we can tell this by looking at what infants look at, by measuring what they look at. And so if they're presented with the same stimulus over and over again, they look at it less. And that is one way for us to understand what babies can process. Uh, if you give them a very similar stimulus, they probably won't look at it for as long because they've habituated to that sort of stimulus. Um, as we'll see, this idea of habituation becomes very important when it comes to performing experiments in order to learn what babies understand about the world. One thing that infants do very early on is facial mimicry. Experiments have been done showing that newborns, even if they're just an hour old or so, will in fact mimic the facial expressions of people around them. So that is seems to be a fairly innate ability and an innate tendency that infants will imitate the faces around them without having to learn to do so, and they know how to do that at birth. Of course, infants are not born with all of the physical skills that a person has. Um, they are born with a couple of important reflexes that allow them to survive. Some of the most famous are rooting and sucking. Rooting is a tendency for an infant to nuzzle something that touches its cheek. So it will turn toward that stimulus. And that, of course, is a reflex that has evolved to help with nursing, help the baby get food. And of course, there's the sucking reflex, which is that babies will suck on anything that's placed in their mouths. And so the combination of those two reflexes allow the baby to nurse. However, there are a lot of other physical abilities that babies develop gradually. So things like supporting themselves with their arms, rolling over, sitting up, crawling, standing up, walking. So this is a fairly typical progression, and some babies skip one stage or another. Not all babies crawl, for example. And this happens at different time periods, of course. Uh, Typically, a baby will learn to sit before it learns to stand. And walking typically happens around uh, a year or so, maybe a little longer. Other abilities develop before or after that. But there are sort of general principles. There's what I'll call the top to bottom rule, which is uh, often called the cephalocaudal rule, but we're not going to worry about that term in this class. Top to bottom is the idea that physical abilities tend to develop sort of from the head down. So they learn to pick up their head before they learn to sit up, that is, move their torso. And they learn to sit up before they learn to stand, that is, how they learn to control their legs. So there's sort of a top to bottom organization. There's also what's called the proximo-distal rule, or the inside to outside rule. And that rule is that movements of the center of the body tend to be mastered before movements of the extremities. So again, children learn to roll over before they learn how to grasp things with their fingers very well. And so we have that sort of inside to outside development. And one of the biggest contributors, certainly to the field of development, and really to the field of psychology in general, is a Swiss psychologist named Jean Piaget. And Piaget lived during the 20th century, so not that long ago, and had some really foundational theories about cognitive development in children. And he came up with 4 stages of child development. And these really haven't changed that much. The evidence for them is pretty solid, and they haven't had to undergo too much revision. There have been a couple of things that have been changed about his theories. One is just the timing with which these stages occur. And they tend to occur earlier than Piaget originally thought. Uh, and that doesn't come really from any theoretical basis. That comes from the fact that it's taken a while to develop really good experiments, good methods for testing what children think about. So Piaget was working with observational techniques that were good for the time, but since then we've come up with ways of testing what babies really know. And so as we've developed those experimental methods, we've come to understand that babies have cognitive milestones before Piaget thought. Not a whole lot before, but a bit. Also, Piaget again organized development into 4 distinct stages. And to Piaget, these were very concrete. You transition from one to the next, and then that was it. They didn't overlap. Once you got to the next one, you didn't regress. And now we know those boundaries are not as distinct. So a child might progress into certain aspects of the next stage and retain aspects of the previous stage, or they might develop new abilities but then not exercise them consistently. And so there are transitional periods that don't fall distinctly into these nice categories. However, all that being said, Piaget's stages still hold up pretty well. So what are Piaget's stages of cognitive development? Well, there are 4 of them, and the first is the sensory motor stage. And this starts at birth and lasts until about the child is 2 years old. And this stage is really about the child learning how to detect the environment, how to interact with it in a limited sense, how to move around. Um, and so, again, very limited in terms of physical abilities. And this is kind of the information gathering stage. How does the child learn about the world? And as the child learns, it develops what Piaget referred to as schemas, which are theories for how the world works, ideas, predictions about what's going to happen uh, in the physical world. So the child's understanding of the physical world is pretty limited, but it starts to develop cause and effect relationships. So that's what a schema is. It's a theory about how the world works. And as the child gathers more information, the child exhibits what are known as assimilation and accommodation. And these are kind of 2 sides of the same coin. Assimilation is when the child applies an existing schema to a new stimulus. So the child has perhaps learned how to reach out and grasp an object and pull it closer. So that is a schema. The prediction that if the child reaches out and grabs something and then pulls it, that the object will come closer. That's obvious to us, but it's something the child has to learn. Assimilation is when an object the child has never interacted with before, nevertheless comes closer when the child reaches out and pulls on it. So applying an existing schema to a new stimulus. Accommodation, again, is kind of the opposite in many ways. Accommodation is when it's not the object or the stimulus is being incorporated into the schema, it's that the schema is what has to change. So your book uses a good example of the child has learned how to reach out and pull an object, but if that object is a cat, that cat may run away. So instead of coming closer, as the child is used to for inanimate objects, the object goes farther away. So the child has to update its schema. And that is the process of accommodation, changing the schemas. Now, if you give a child, or an adult for that matter, a stimulus like this here on the right, we'll look at it for a moment, but it conforms to our ideas of the physical world. It's just a plain wooden cube, not that remarkable. And so we wouldn't look at it for very long. If I give you this figure, however, you'll look at it longer because it violates the rules of the physical world. This three-dimensional object cannot exist. And so people tend to look at this object longer, sort of trying to figure it out. And babies will do the same thing with objects and events in the world that don't conform to those rules. So I've already mentioned how babies can habituate. They'll not look at something very much if they've already witnessed it, if it is the same thing they've seen before. But if they see something new that perhaps, especially if it violates the rules of the world that they've developed, they'll look for longer. And this can be used to test ideas like object permanence. So this is the idea that objects don't cease to exist just because we can't see them. In fact, they are still there. They are just occluded. They are hidden. And Piaget tested this idea by looking at whether infants would move around and look behind the occluding object to see if the original object was still there. But that requires the child to be able to move. However, we can now do what's called a preferential looking time experiment, where we see how long the child looks in order to understand whether the child believes the object is still there or not. So there was a really clever experiment that was done in which a baby was set in front of this apparatus, and the way this thing worked was there was a screen that could rotate, and it was sort of like a little drawbridge. It would start off pointing toward the child and then rotate up until it was now pointing away. And then a block, a solid object, was placed behind the drawbridge, and then it rotated. It stopped when it hit the block, and then it rotates back. And this is the sort of thing the baby expects. The baby has developed the idea that objects can't pass through one another, and that the block is still there even if the drawbridge is hiding it. And so when the two objects make contact and the bridge can't go any further, that is not surprising to the baby. The baby does not look for very long. However, if something impossible happens, as they put it, the baby will look for longer because it's violated the rules of the world. In this case, what the experimenters have done is put that block down, and then in a split second, they pull the switch, and now what the baby is actually looking at is behind a one-way mirror. So they're seeing actually a different part of the apparatus, a different chamber, but they don't know that. It happened too quickly. And so in this case, the drawbridge looks like it passes right through that solid object. And sure enough, as we see here on the right, babies will look longer at the impossible event, the one that violates the rules of the world, than at the possible event, the one that occurs just as the baby expected. So we can use this looking time as a way of assessing what the baby thinks about the world, what the baby's beliefs are about the physical world. So this is a very powerful tool for understanding cognitive development, because obviously babies can't talk yet and certainly can't speak at a very sophisticated level. So it's hard to ask them about what their rules are for the world. But by using this looking time approach, uh, you can assess cognitive development at much earlier stages. After the sensory motor stage in Piaget's theory, you have what's called the pre-operational stage. And this lasts from about age 2 to about age 6. Again, there's always variance. And this is where the child really starts to understand the physical world, starts to develop some more sophisticated rules, has more or less mastered the ability to look at things, to listen for things, to detect the physical world, and has mastered the ability to move around in the world. So the baby can move around, can detect the world, and now really starts learning more about those rules. However, uh, the child doesn't really have the concept of subjectivity yet. So at this point, children believe that whatever they perceive is the way the world actually is. So there's no idea that they may view something differently from someone else, but not even the idea that the way a stimulus is presented or the circumstances of the stimulus can alter perception. So again, they take what they're presented with, what they perceive, very literally. Once they reach the concrete operational stage, which lasts from about 6 to 11, uh, they understand more about not just the physical world, but also actions and their consequences for the physical world. So they've learned the rules, they've learned kind of how the world works, and now they start to learn more about what happens when they interact with the world. So one common example here is the idea of conservation. If you present a small child in the 2 to 6 range with modeling clay, and you started off in a small ball, but then you flatten it out, you can ask them if it's now bigger, and they'll say yes, because from the angle that they're looking at the clay from, it takes up more area. It looks bigger. But once they reach the concrete operational stage, they know that it's not really taking up more volume, that it's been transformed, that operations like squishing the clay don't change the amount of clay that's there. Another common way of testing this is to put liquid in a glass and then pour it into a taller glass and ask the child if there's now more liquid. So the taller glass is skinnier, the level of the liquid is higher, and small children will say, yes, there's more liquid. Children that have reached the concrete operational stage say, no, it's the same amount, because those children have learned that pouring doesn't change the amount of liquid that's there, and that the shape of the container can alter the apparent height or width of the liquid, but it doesn't actually alter the amount of liquid present. And so that's the idea of conservation, that the amount of objects or the amount of mass present doesn't change just by changing its appearance. After that, children reach the formal operational stage, around about age 11 or later. And here they can start to deal with abstract concepts. So before, the world was very concrete. Transformations of the world were very concrete. Now they can talk about more abstract ideas, principles, like freedom, love, liberty. And they can also talk about hypotheticals. Can you imagine a situation where X or Y happened, even if they haven't experienced it? So they can start to imagine scenarios that contradict the real world, uh, and they can extrapolate from that. They can reason about these hypotheticals or these counterfactuals, things that are not true in the world, but use your imagination, and you can imagine consequences for events or for actions. And so that is the formal operational stage, that ability to operate at a more abstract level. So children, of course, develop other abilities as well. One of the most important is the ability to understand that other people have minds of their own. So early on, children exhibit egocentrism, which is an inability to realize that other people view the world differently, that the world appears different to them, that they have different perspectives. And so children are actually pretty good, or from a fairly early age, at understanding that other people have their own desires. They might want different things. They might have different preferences. And that is not so hard for a small child to understand. What's harder is to understand that other people have their own emotional states and they have their own emotional reactions. So that becomes a bit harder for the child to develop the ability to believe that other people have a different emotional state than they do. They often think that people feel the way that they do. And a large part of that comes from theory of mind, which is our ability to mentally model others as having desires, emotions, and beliefs. And one way this is tested in small children is with what's called the false belief test. Now, your book uses one example of a story like this. The most common is actually often referred to as the Sally Ann task. And that's what I've depicted here on the right. And so in this task, the child is told a story saying that Sally is playing with a doll, places the doll in the basket, and then walks off. And then Ann is there. Ann walks over, picks up the doll, puts it in the toy box. And then the child is asked, if Sally comes back, where was Sally first look for her doll? And a small child isn't able to understand that Sally doesn't know everything that the child knows. And so the child will say that Sally will look in the box because that's where the child knows the doll actually is. The child isn't able to think about the fact that Sally wasn't there to witness the doll being moved, that Sally has her own beliefs about where the doll is. And so small children will say that that Sally will look for the doll in the toy box. However, after a certain developmental period, the child will start to say that Sally will look for it in the basket. They're able to understand that Sally doesn't know everything that they know. That Sally has her own beliefs, has her own information, and that she will behave according to that information. So that is the false belief test. And it takes until around age 4 for children to develop that ability, to pass that false belief test. And one of the best predictors for how quickly the child will pass that test is language ability. So the better the child's language ability, but in particular, the more familiar the child is with psychological words like want, need, believe, feel. Those seem to be good predictors of performance on the false belief task. We're not quite clear on why that is, whether it's the words themselves that force the child to think about psychological concepts, whether the fact that those words allow you to construct more complex ideas about the internal states of others. We don't know. But language is a good predictor for this social ability. Children can also pick up on social cues. So one of the earliest is what's called joint attention. And here we see in this picture in the bottom right, that a baby is looking at his mother, and when mom looks over at an object, that the child will look too. The child understands that motion of moving the head with the eyes open is intended to direct the person's gaze. They're changing what they're looking at. And so the child will want to look at that as well. Whereas other emotions, other behaviors, won't cause the child to look in that direction. It's specific to having your eyes open and turning your head. And the child has learned to direct their attention, that's why it's called joint attention, to the same target. Children will also imitate adults. And that perhaps is not that surprising, but what is interesting is that they will actually imitate not just the physical motions, but also the intent of the adult. So your book uses the example of a jar, and if the adult is trying to open it and then slips, the child doesn't imitate the slip if they're around 18 months old. They just imitate the intent. They try to open the jar. Now, it is possible for children to over-imitate, That is, they'll imitate all the aspects of a behavior, whether those details are relevant or not to the task. So your book mentions that as well. There's an experiment done where adults were basically trying to open a puzzle box to get to a toy, and some of the actions they took were important to opening the puzzle box, and some were irrelevant. And the children would often imitate the irrelevant actions in addition to the ones that were actually critical for getting the toy. And they know, and the experimenters did extra tests to determine that it's not just imitating out of habit, and that it's not trying to please the parent. Um, and so they know that the children are actually imitating these behaviors, these irrelevant behaviors, because they think that they're important for getting to the target, for achieving the goal. There's also what's known as social referencing. And this is where a child, before engaging with a new stimulus or making a new behavior, will look back and check with the adult, usually the caregiver. And so, as sort of a way of checking whether the behavior is okay, whether this stimulus is safe. And children do this a lot. They'll do it with if they're interacting with a new toy or about to try a new food. Also, you may notice that if a small child falls down or does something that might be painful, they'll often look to the adult, look for the adult's reaction before they start to react either by crying or by shrugging it off. So their response to falling down or what have you can often depend on the response of the adult around them. So that's social referencing, looking to others in order to understand whether a behavior is acceptable or harmful. So there are, of course, other influences on development as well, and these are social in nature, and this highlights the importance of social contact. So, for example, monkeys that are raised in social isolation uh, tend to exhibit anxiety. They tend to exhibit aggressive behaviors. They don't know how to interact with other monkeys if they're isolated for the first few months of their lives. Also, the importance of parents was highlighted by what's often known as the wire mother experiment. And in this experiment, uh, the baby monkeys don't have access to their actual mother. Uh, they have a choice between sort of a model, a kind of a robotic-looking version of a mother monkey that is nevertheless has a face, is also furry and soft and cuddly. Uh, and the monkey has to choose between that and the so-called wire mother, which is, as the name suggests, made out of wire. It's cold. It's not very cuddly. It does have a face, and most importantly, it has a bottle, so the monkey can get food from the wire mother, but not from the furry mother. Nevertheless, monkeys prefer that furry mother because it's soft and warm. And so the idea there is that we have an innate need for comfort from parents that goes beyond food. It's not just about getting sustenance. And of course, this result is surprising to behaviorists. Uh, Behaviorists view behavior as resulting from reward and punishment. And so a behaviorist account would fully expect the wire mother to be preferred because the wire mother gives food rewards. Um, and yet the monkeys preferred the furry mother. And this leads into the idea of attachment, which is the emotional bond between a child and a caregiver. And this is examined using the strange situation test. And in this test, the primary caregiver, usually the mother, brings a child into a room the child has not been in before. Uh, they get used to the room, and then the caregiver leaves. And the child may or may not be distressed by that. They may still be exploring the room or playing with toys in the room. Uh, After a while, the caregiver comes back, and the experimenter observes not just the child's behavior when the parent leaves, but also when the parent returns. And those responses, those behaviors, indicate the child's so-called attachment style. So the most common is the secure attachment style. And here, the child may become distressed when the parent leaves, but if they are distressed, they are comforted when the parent returns. So the child will seek out the parent upon their return and will no longer be distressed. And the thinking is that that kind of behavior stems from a belief on the part of the child that the caregiver is going to respond to their needs. So they're distressed when the parent leaves because that's the person that provides for them. They're comforted when the parent returns, and they seek out the parent to attend to those needs. The avoidant attachment style occurs when the baby doesn't seem to notice that the parent has left and doesn't seek out the parent when the parent comes back. Uh, and here the belief is thought to be that the caregiver is not going to respond to the needs of the child, so the child doesn't need to take notice of the parent coming or going, because they're not going to get the care they need from that individual. So their leaving and coming back is not important. The ambivalent attachment style indicates uncertainty about the caregiver. So the caregiver sometimes responds to needs, sometimes doesn't. And so what happens here is that the baby may become distressed at the exit of the parent, uh, but when the parent comes back, the child is not comforted. Um, and again, this indicates that the child is not sure whether the caregiver is going to take care of them or not. The final style is called disorganized. And this is where behavior is inconsistent. It doesn't fall into one of these above categories, or it represents a mixture of those categories. And here, the thinking is that the caregiver's role is confusing. It's not just that the baby is uncertain about what the caregiver is going to do, it's that the caregiver represents both a source of comfort and satisfying needs, but also a potential source of anxiety and harm. And it's thought that this often occurs in abusive environments, and which will put the child in a dilemma because you have the same person who not only provides food and satisfies needs, but also is a potential source of harm. And so that is what leads to disorganized attachment. And again, we can look at the beliefs of a child, whether they're secure or one of these other three styles, insecure. And here I'm using the original figure from the research. The figure from your book actually is wrong. So I pulled this figure here. It will obviously be available in the slides as well. And so here we can look at how long a baby stares at a picture. And in this case, the picture is one of two kinds. Either it's a picture of a caregiver responding to a child, or it's a picture of a caregiver ignoring a child. And of course, the secure attachment style, the belief is that the caregiver will respond. So secure children look longer at the picture of the unresponsive caregiver because it violates their expectations. They expect the caregiver to take care of the child, so when they don't, they look longer. Conversely, when shown a picture of a responsive caregiver, it's actually the insecure babies that look longer. This is not the world they're used to. They're not used to having a responsive caregiver, and so that's surprising. They look longer. And there are many effects of attachment style. It seems to affect parental behavior when the child grows up. It seems to affect social relationships. Uh, and it can also affect our memories. So depending on attachment style, this is still looking at children, uh, securely attached children will recall more positive events than negative events when presented with both. Those with an avoidant attachment style will remember more negative events than positive events. And again, this seems to correspond to how events in the world map onto the expectations that the child has formed as a result of their relationship with their caregiver. And that brings us to moral development. That is, of course, development having to deal with decision making about ethics, about right and wrong, about harms and benefits. And Piaget certainly had ideas in this realm. Uh, One transition that he noticed in children was from realism to relativism. And small children uh, deal with moral decision making in first in the mode of realism, which is the idea that they're handed a set of moral instructions, and they deal with those as though they are the absolute truth. That right and wrong are easy to distinguish. That if they're given a set of rules, they should follow them. And later on, they develop and realize that while there might be ethical principles involved, some of these things are also just conventions. So small children don't distinguish between things that are not done because they are morally wrong and things that aren't done because they're not conventional. And so that's the distinction that's made later on in life. But the idea that some people might view something as right and other people might view it as wrong, that's alien to a child. So they, again, accept a set of moral rules that they're handed and view them very much in black or white terms. Children also move from prescriptions to principles. That is, they're given a set of rules to follow, and at first they follow those specific rules. They don't extrapolate broader principles from them, but later on they do. So they might be told explicitly to share their food at lunch. So they might do that. They might follow that rule. But they may not think about sharing their food at dinner or at breakfast or sharing toys. They have not yet understood that that rule is there to embody a more general principle of sharing. And so that's a transition that also happens during childhood, that children learn that specific sets of rules are there to enforce moral principles, and that they can realize those principles and obey those principles uh, in situations they haven't been in before, even if there isn't a particular rule about that situation. Children also move from thinking about outcomes to thinking about intentions. And this is particularly important for understanding the moral consequences of accidental actions. So if a child breaks a toy accidentally, that is a smaller moral transgression, if it's one at all, than breaking one on purpose. Now, the outcome is the same. The toy is broken. But children learn eventually that the intentions matter. That you should forgive someone for doing something accidentally uh, more easily than forgiving someone who did something on purpose. Now, a psychologist named Kohlberg came along and developed this a little bit further and put this idea into distinct stages, sort of like Piaget did for his stages of cognitive development. So for Kohlberg, there was what's called the pre-conventional stage, and this is uh, indicated by the child's thinking more about consequences. So the consequences of an action make it right or wrong. So the trouble with this, of course, is that moral principles are not always enforced. You can get away with bad behavior, and you may not be rewarded for good behavior. So in this pre-conventional stage, uh, it's sort of okay to do something wrong if you don't get caught. And so children at very young ages tend to think very much about whether they will be punished. They will often lie to avoid punishment. So they'll make some transgression, they'll break a rule, and then they'll lie about breaking the rules. And they'll make another ethical transgression in order to avoid the consequences of those actions. And so children tend to focus on consequences rather than principles. So if a child is told not to steal a cookie, they will think that stealing a cookie is wrong because if you steal a cookie and you get caught, you'll get punished. And so that punishment is what makes it a wrong action. When they enter the conventional stage, they start to think more about social norms. So whether people would approve of the action or not is what makes it moral. So would your parents approve if you lied? Probably not. So their approval is what makes it right or wrong. Adhering to social rules is what makes something right or wrong. Adhering to laws. So laws are social norms that have been written down and are enforced. And so children will often think that if you break the law, that is always morally wrong because you've broken that social norm. When you reach the post-conventional stage, you start to think more in terms of values. So not necessarily consequences, and not necessarily social norms, what everyone else will think, but you start to think about core values. So things like fairness, liberty, the right to live. So these are more abstract principles, but again, they may contravene thinking during the pre-conventional and conventional stages. So it could be something could be morally right, and you could end up being harmed for it. Maybe you'll be punished for doing the right thing. Maybe doing the right thing is against the law. Both of those things could be true, but a person may still do them if the action adheres to core values. So at this stage, people realize that consequences don't determine what's right, and social norms don't necessarily determine what's right. Those things may all align, but they may not. And so a person may feel obligated to adhere to those core values instead. What's also interesting is that uh, small social cues can still affect our behavior. There's a famous experiment done where, in a break room in an office situation, people have the opportunity to steal food. And if the break room had a picture of a flower in it, they stole the food at a certain rate. If a bulletin in the break room had a set of eyes, not obviously not a real person, just a set of cartoon eyes, they stole the food less frequently. And so again, we may be in that post-conventional stage. We may adhere to core values, and yet subtle subliminal cues even about social acceptance, for example, can influence our behavior, whether we will commit a right or wrong action. So those social norms and social approval still have a subtle influence on our behavior, even if we are at that post-conventional stage. There's also the idea of moral intuition, that we have kind of a gut feeling about right or wrong, and that this guides a lot of our behavior. And there seems to be a lot of truth to this. So, back to the trolley problem. Uh, During our unit on decision making, I talked about the trolley problem, where an individual is in a situation where they're on a footbridge above a set of railroad tracks. There's a train barreling down, or a trolley, barreling down at 5 workers, and the workers will be killed if the person does nothing. There is, however, a large individual on the bridge with them, and if the person pushes that individual onto the tracks, that one person will stop the train with their body. They'll die, but the 5 people will be saved. Most people say it is not morally acceptable to push that large individual onto the tracks. However, if you change the scenario and say that the same person is at a switch, and if the trolley is coming down the tracks, that if the switch is flipped, that trolley will run over one person as opposed to 5, and five people will be saved at the expense of one. Now, the situation is similar in many ways. So in both cases, you have one person dying if the individual acts, and 5 people being saved. If that person does nothing, if they neither push the individual nor flip the switch, then those 5 people will die. So it is the same trade-off being made. Do you act and kill one person, or not act and allow 5 people to die? However, in the switch scenario, most people say, yes, it's okay to throw that switch. The trade-off, again, is the same. In both cases, you are killing one person to save 5. Uh, and people make arguments about, well, in the switch case, the switch could have just as easily been in the other position, so it's really just random chance. Whereas the footbridge version, that large individual was never really in danger. So that argument is often made. Um, One big factor here seems to be the fact that you have to push one person, whereas you just flip the switch in the other case. So that personal contact seems to influence moral decision making. People are just physically uncomfortable at the thought of pushing the individual, but they're not with flipping the switch. And it's hard for them to describe why they make that decision in one case and not the other. They might try. Uh, but the idea here is that our physiological responses actually have a big influence on our decision making. We often can't come up with rational justifications for why we think one action is wrong and one action is right. Uh, they just sort of feels right to us. We listen to our physiology, and this is not dissimilar from the somatic marker hypothesis, where decision making is influenced by your physiological state. And so there does seem to be a lot of truth to that, that our physiology helps us decide whether something is moral or immoral. Okay, that will do it for this unit. Next time, we will keep looking at development, and we'll look at later development. So, adolescence and adulthood. We'll look at sexual development and sexual orientation. We'll look at how the brain changes from adolescence into adulthood and even into old age. And we'll see that changes in development occur even in that late adulthood phase. Cognitive abilities change, uh, psychological experience changes. How people choose to live their lives has a tendency to change as well in consistent ways. So we'll see all of that next time, and I will see you then.